With half his presentation drafted, Daniel sought a different perspective. He interviewed Professor Washington, who specialized in Cold War history and civil rights. Their conversation in her book-lined office stretched far beyond the scheduled hour as they discussed how the post-war era shaped modern America. Daniel structured his third section around America's dual struggles: the external Cold War against communism and the internal battle for civil rights. He chronicled how the Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe while containment policy led to proxy conflicts worldwide. The suburban boom and highway system transformed American geography while television changed its culture. Daniel was careful to highlight the Montgomery bus boycott, freedom rides, and how Martin Luther King Jr.'s moral leadership challenged the nation to live up to its founding principles. As his timeline progressed through Vietnam's divisions and Watergate's disillusionment, Daniel observed how America continually reinvented itself. The Reagan Revolution, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the tech boom of the 1990s closed this section of American resilience and adaptation. When Professor Washington reviewed his draft, she smiled. "You're capturing the contradictions that make American history so fascinating, a nation constantly struggling to reconcile its ideals with reality." Energized by this feedback, Daniel visited the campus media center to view archival footage. The black and white images of troops returning from World War II gave way to color broadcasts of the space race, cultural revolutions, and political assassinations that defined the 1960s. He watched Richard Nixon's resignation speech, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the Challenger disaster, moments when the nation collectively held its breath. "I need to show how global events and domestic policy intertwined," Daniel explained to Marcus, the media librarian who helped curate his selections. "Try this," Marcus suggested, pulling footage of the 1968 Democratic Convention protests alongside clips of Apollo 8 astronauts reading from Genesis while orbiting the moon that same tumultuous year. American history is full of these contrasts. Daniel incorporated these visual juxtapositions into his notes. Suburban prosperity against urban renewal projects that displaced communities. The optimism of Kennedy's New Frontier alongside duck and cover drills in elementary schools. Technological triumphs of microprocessors and moonwalks contrasted with environmental concerns that birthed the EPA. Later that week, Daniel interviewed his mother's colleague Dr. Chen, who had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1970s. America was changing its identity then, she explained, describing how the Immigration Act of 1965 had diversified the nation's demographic makeup. The American dream was being redefined by new voices. This conversation led Daniel to explore how social movements beyond civil rights, feminism, environmentalism, LGBTQ+ advocacy, disability rights, had expanded America's conversation about equality. He traced how landmark Supreme Court decisions from Brown v. Board of Education to Roe v. Wade to United States v. Nixon reflected shifting cultural values, while economic transitions from manufacturing to service industries reshaped communities and voting patterns. As Daniel organized his notes on this complex period, he appreciated Professor Washington's earlier advice: "Don't try to simplify American history. Embrace its messiness." The story of America as superpower wasn't just about military might or economic dominance, but about ongoing dialogues between competing visions of national purpose. For the final section, Daniel organized a student discussion group. His classmates from diverse backgrounds shared their perspectives on recent history, events they had personally witnessed or experienced. Sarah described her family's reaction to 9/11 events, while Miguel explained how the 2008 financial crisis affected his community. Zoe spoke about participating in her first election, and James discussed his military service in Afghanistan. Daniel synthesized these contemporary accounts into his conclusion, noting how the War on Terror, Great Recession, and polarized politics had challenged American unity. He highlighted technological revolutions that connected people globally while sometimes deepening social divisions. Climate change concerns, pandemic responses, and movements for social justice represented unfinished chapters in the American story. On presentation day, Daniel stood before his classmates, surprisingly calm. American history isn't a single narrative, he began, but millions of interwoven stories. For the next 25 minutes, he guided his audience through 4 centuries of triumph and tragedy, innovation and inequality, conflict and cooperation. As he concluded, Daniel understood that his presentation wasn't comprehensive. No 25-minute summary could be. But it captured something essential about America's ongoing journey toward fulfilling its founding promises. Professor Martinez nodded approvingly as applause filled the room. What makes America's story unique, Daniel concluded, isn't that we've solved all our problems, but that each generation accepts the responsibility to address them. Our history isn't perfect, but it's perfectly human, full of failures, second chances, and the persistent hope that we can create a more perfect union. Following the discussion group, Daniel spent a weekend organizing his notes at a local coffee shop. The barista noticed his sprawling timeline. "History project?" she asked, delivering his 3rd espresso of the morning. Trying to condense 4 centuries into 25 minutes, Daniel replied with a weary smile. "Good luck with that," she laughed. "I can barely explain what happened last week in 25 minutes. Her comment crystallized Daniel's challenge. How could he address recent history when its significance was still unfolding? Unlike earlier periods where consensus interpretations existed, contemporary events lacked historical distance. The digital revolution, simultaneously connecting and dividing society, was transforming how Americans worked, learned, and related to one another. Climate policies, healthcare debates, and economic inequality presented challenges that would define future chapters of American history. That evening, Daniel video called his older sister Alicia, a software engineer in Seattle. "How would you describe America in the 21st century so far?" he asked. "Contradictory," she replied after consideration. "We have unprecedented access to information, but struggle to agree on basic facts. We've made progress on inclusion, but still face systemic barriers. We carry supercomputers in our pockets, but worry about job security." This conversation helped Daniel frame his final section. Rather than attempting definitive judgments about recent events, he would emphasize continuing themes: technological disruption reminiscent of the Industrial Revolution, social movements echoing earlier civil rights struggles, economic transformations paralleling the shift from agriculture to manufacturing, and global challenges reflecting America's evolving role in world affairs. Daniel created a computing visual, a pendulum swinging between individualism and collective action, isolation and engagement, tradition and innovation. This metaphor captured how American history moved in patterns rather than straight lines, with each generation confronting familiar questions in new contexts. His final slide posed the question that had animated American democracy since its founding. How do we form a more perfect union while honoring both unity and diversity, security and liberty, stability and progress? Daniel Foster sat nervously in the campus auditorium as Professor Martinez announced the assignment. "Your final project: condense American history into a 25-minute presentation." Scanning the syllabus, Daniel realized he had just 2 weeks to prepare. As a history major who struggled with public speaking, this would be his greatest challenge yet. That evening, Daniel began with America's origins. He traced the journey from indigenous civilizations through European colonization, carefully noting how the Iroquois Confederacy's democratic principles influenced the Founding Fathers. He documented the Revolutionary War, not just as a rebellion against taxation, but as an ideological break from monarchy towards self-governance. The Constitutional Convention emerged in his notes as a series of compromises rather than a moment of perfect harmony. As he worked through the early republic's expansion, Daniel highlighted how manifest destiny brought prosperity for some while displacing Native Americans. The contradictions of a nation founded on freedom while practicing slavery became central to his outline. When he reached the Civil War, he realized how this bloody conflict represented both America's greatest moral failure and its potential for redemption. By midnight, Daniel had only completed the first section of his presentation, But he understood now why Professor Martinez had assigned this seemingly impossible task. American history was a complex tapestry of triumphs and failures that defied easy summary. The next morning, Daniel visited the university archives. Amidst dusty shelves and climate-controlled rooms, he discovered primary sources that breathed life into his research. He carefully examined a fragile letter from a Revolutionary War soldier to his wife, describing the harsh winter at Valley Forge and unwavering belief in the cause of liberty. Another document, a plantation ledger from South Carolina, meticulously recorded human beings as property, a stark reminder of the economic foundations of slavery. "You're diving deep," remarked Dr. Winters, the head archivist, noticing Daniel's intense focus. "Most students just skim the surface. I'm trying to understand how it all connects," Daniel replied, gesturing to his scattered notes. Dr. Winters smiled. "That's exactly the point. American history isn't linear. It's interconnected waves of action and reaction." This insight helped Daniel structure his narrative. He began seeing how the Alien and Sedition Acts revealed early tensions between security and liberty, how Jacksonian democracy expanded voting rights for white men while intensifying oppression of others, and how economic policies sparked regional conflicts that escalated towards civil war. That afternoon, sitting under a century-old oak on campus, Daniel sketched a timeline highlighting pivotal moments: the Louisiana Purchase doubling national territory, the Trail of Tears demonstrating the human cost of expansion, the Missouri Compromise temporarily masking sectional divisions, and the Dred Scott decision unraveling fragile political compromises. The weight of condensing nearly a century of complex history into mere minutes felt overwhelming, until Daniel realized his presentation couldn't cover everything. Instead, he would trace the central theme of America's founding promise, that all are created equal, and how each generation struggled, sometimes violently, to define who all included. With renewed clarity, he refined his notes on the Emancipation Proclamation and 13th Amendment as profound, if imperfect, steps toward fulfilling that promise. The following weekend, Daniel ventured to his grandfather's farm in Pennsylvania. Grandpa Joe, a retired high school history teacher, had lived through the Great Depression and World War II. As they sat on the porch overlooking fields that had been in their family for generations, Daniel recorded stories that textbooks couldn't capture. Daniel incorporated these personal narratives into his second section, America's transformation from an agricultural society into an industrial powerhouse. The Reconstruction era's unfulfilled promises of equality gave way to the Gilded Age's stark wealth disparities. Immigrants poured through Ellis Island, bringing diverse cultures that would reshape American identity despite nativist resistance. The Progressive Era emerged as reformers confronted corruption and unsafe working conditions. Daniel noted how America's isolationism dissolved during World War I, only to resurface afterward, until Pearl Harbor forced the nation into World War II. His grandfather's voice broke as he described friends who never returned from European battlefields. America became a superpower, Daniel wrote in his notes, but at tremendous human cost. As he organized this section, Daniel realized that each historical period contained the seeds of the next, progress and reaction constantly intertwined. In the university library the next day, Daniel pored over faded newspapers from the early 1900s. Headlines trumpeted the Wright brothers' first flight, Ford's assembly line innovations, and women marching for suffrage. In photographs, he saw faces of child laborers captured by Lewis Hine, sullen eyes that challenged the nation's conscience. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire accounts revealed how tragedy often preceded reform, while political cartoons lampooned the excesses of railroad barons and corrupt political machines. A history department graduate assistant named Elena spotted Daniel surrounded by primary sources and offered to help. "I'm specializing in labor movements," she explained, pointing to images of Pullman strikers and coal miners. These conflicts shaped modern worker protections. Together they traced how technological innovations, telephones, automobiles, radio, transformed daily life, while financial speculation led to the devastating 1929 crash. Daniel was particularly moved by Depression-era oral histories. Farmers watching topsoil blow away during the Dust Bowl, veterans marching on Washington for promised bonuses, and families finding dignity through New Deal work programs. What strikes me, Daniel told Elena, is how resilient ordinary Americans were through extraordinary hardships. That's what I love about this era, she replied. It's not just about presidents and policies. It's about people adapting to massive change. This perspective helped Daniel balance his presentation. He crafted a section highlighting both institutional developments and everyday experiences. Immigrants processing through Ellis Island, juxtaposed with settlement houses that help them adapt, assembly line efficiency, alongside organizing efforts for 8-hour workdays, and the scientific management of Frederick Taylor contrasted with the artistic revolution of the Harlem Renaissance. That evening, Daniel created a visual timeline connecting seemingly disparate events, how Prohibition reflected cultural tensions between tradition and modernity, how the 19th Amendment culminated decades of women's activism, and how the GI Bill would soon transform American education and housing. The more he researched, the more he appreciated how this tumultuous period had fundamentally reshaped American society.